The moment this message finds its way onto a screen is never really the moment it begins. It begins earlier, quietly, when the inner world starts asking questions the mouth is too tired to speak. Somewhere beneath daily competence, beneath the practiced calm and the polite answers, there is often a hidden tremor, the fear that what was felt so intensely might have been foolish, the suspicion that longing is only a form of self-betrayal dressed as devotion, and yet the psyche does not repeat a question without purpose. When a thought returns with unusual persistence, it is rarely random. It is usually a signal that the soul is still negotiating with truth. The modern mind calls it coincidence, an algorithm, a pattern, a feedback loop, but the deeper self, what Jung would call the inner compass of individuation, recognizes a different kind of timing, not magical thinking, but meaningful convergence. The psyche has its own language, and it speaks in symbols, in sensation, in intuition that arrives without permission. What feels like too much is often the unconscious pressing upward, refusing to let a person abandon what matters simply because the outer world has offered silence. Silence is seductive because it provides an easy conclusion. It lets doubt pretend it is wisdom. It lets resignation masquerade as maturity. This is why the central experience here is not romance alone, but a confrontation with self-worth. The intensity of a bond, real or still unfolding, becomes a mirror. It reveals where the heart is loyal, where the ego is afraid, and where the inner feminine has been trained to distrust her own knowing. Female empowerment, in its most honest form, is not the hardening of the heart, it is the return of emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel deeply without collapsing into pleading, the ability to desire without forfeiting dignity, the ability to trust intuition without turning it into a cage. There is a particular kind of doubt that visits those who love with depth. It whispers that tenderness is naive, that spiritual sensitivity is delusion, that longing is weakness. But Jung warned of a psyche split against itself. When the conscious mind rejects what the unconscious knows, life becomes an argument with one's own soul. So the first correction is internal. The feelings are not automatically exaggeration. The intensity is not automatically pathology. Sometimes it is projection. Yes, sometimes the beloved becomes a screen for unmet needs, a vessel for an inner archetype. But projection does not make the experience worthless. It makes it instructive. It shows what the psyche is starving for: safety, recognition, reciprocity, the sacred reassurance of being chosen without self-erasure. And yet there is another possibility, that something genuine exists beneath the confusion and energetic chord, an unfinished conversation, a bond that continues because it carries meaning. When a connection lingers, it can be obsession, or it can be the psyche insisting that a lesson is unfinished. The difference is revealed by the quality of the inner state. Obsession depletes, humiliates, and shrinks the self. Meaning, even when painful, tends to expand awareness. It pushes the person back toward wholeness, toward clearer boundaries, toward a stronger spine. It does not ask for self-abandonment. It demands self-respect. Distance, in this light, stops being proof of failure and becomes a testing ground. The outer separation exposes what the inner world does when it is not being fed by certainty. The ego panics, tries to control outcomes, checks for signs, hunts for evidence, performs devotion like a ritual to ward off loss. But the soul works differently. The soul does not chase, it steadies. It does not beg, it becomes magnetic. This is where empowerment enters, not through denial of desire, but through mastery of response. A woman does not become powerful by not caring, she becomes powerful by caring without bargaining away her peace. The invisible world, whether described as spirit, synchronicity, or the unconscious web connecting two psyches, often announces itself through subtle phenomena, sudden waves of emotion that do not match the day, an unexpected memory arriving with vivid color, the feeling of warmth in the chest, as if affection has passed through the body like light. In Jungian terms, these are not proof in a courtroom sense, they are symbolic communications. They can be telepathy, or they can be the psyche processing attachment and meaning. Either way, they deserve to be handled with maturity, not as commands to chase, but as invitations to understand, because the deeper truth is this: The outcome is not the only sacred thing here. The transformation is, if someone withdraws, it may be indifference, or it may be fear, a shadow response to intimacy. People often retreat not because love is absent, but because love is too revealing. Real connection has a way of shining directly onto wounds that have been protected for years. The shadow does not vanish just because something beautiful appears. It often intensifies, scrambling for control. Silence can be ego armor. It can also be overload, and none of that excuses poor behavior. Yet understanding the anatomy of withdrawal prevents the heart from interpreting everything as personal rejection. Still, empowerment requires a boundary. Silence cannot be turned into a shrine. A bond may be spiritual, but it must also be lived. This is why the most important movement is inward. The task is not passive waiting. The task is alignment. The inner feminine, wise, discerning, self-honoring, does not sit frozen in longing. She builds, she heals, she returns her energy to her own life. She stops bleeding devotion into uncertainty. She learns the difference between faith and fixation. And this is where Jung's idea of individuation becomes a quiet revolution. The psyche does not mature by forcing external outcomes, but by integrating inner opposites, hope and realism, softness and strength, longing and self-possession. When doubt rises, it is not an enemy. It is information about where the self still believes love must be earned through suffering. When impatience rises, it is not a flaw. It is the nervous system asking for safety. And the answer is not to abandon love, but to stop abandoning the self. So if the universe is responding to a question the soul asked, perhaps the response is not merely, "they will return." Perhaps the response is, return to the self first. Become the place where love can land without turning into anxiety. Become the woman who does not confuse intensity with destiny, but also does not dismiss destiny simply because the world cannot measure it. The deepest sign that something is real is not the ache in the chest, it is the way the experience shapes character. If it is guiding the heart toward higher standards, clearer boundaries, deeper self-trust, and a calmer nervous system, then something meaningful is happening, whether reunion arrives tomorrow or not at all. In the next movement, the invisible becomes more structured. The psyche begins to interpret signs, the shadow begins to reveal its motives, and the practice of detachment becomes a form of power rather than punishment. Because what truly belongs to someone cannot be held together by fear, and what is meant to return will only return cleanly when the self is no longer willing to beg for what should be freely given. When the inner world accepts that longing can exist without humiliation, the entire atmosphere changes. The mind stops treating silence like a verdict and starts reading it as a symbol, an empty room that reveals what the heart tries to fill. This is where the psyche becomes honest. The ache is not only about the other person, it is also about the places where the self learned to equate love with uncertainty, to confuse intensity with safety, to interpret distance as proof that something is wrong with her. Jung would call this the old pattern returning in a new costume, an archetypal repetition designed not to punish, but to surface what still needs integration. A bond that persists can easily become a shrine for projection. The beloved becomes the carrier of the anima image, the promise of wholeness, the fantasy of final belonging, and yet the goal of individuation is to reclaim that projected treasure, not by denying the bond, but by refusing to surrender sovereignty. The inner feminine does not beg the outer world to validate her intuition. She refines her intuition until it becomes clear enough to distinguish truth from craving. Empowerment begins when desire is no longer allowed to override discernment. This is why the so-called signs must be held with maturity, sudden melancholy that arrives without explanation, a memory that breaks through the day like lightning, an unexpected warmth in the chest, the strange sense of being watched by the invisible. These experiences may feel like emotional telepathy, and they may also be the unconscious translating attachment into sensation. The important point is not to build a prison from them. The important point is to listen for what they are asking the self to become: calmer, clearer, more anchored. A woman does not become magnetic by monitoring the world for proof. She becomes magnetic by returning her energy to her own life, until her presence feels like a home rather than a question. If another person is withdrawing, The psyche often wants a simple explanation: indifference or love, rejection or fate. But human beings are rarely that clean. The shadow is messy, the ego defends itself in strange ways. Sometimes the withdrawal is the sound of fear, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control, fear of being seen too clearly. The paradox is that deep love can trigger the deepest defenses. People often retreat precisely where they feel most touched, because being touched awakens old wounds. This is not a romantic excuse. It is a psychological reality. Understanding it prevents the heart from turning every pause into self-contempt. The anatomy of silence usually contains an inner conflict. One part of them wants closeness, another part panics at the cost of closeness. The ego says, protect yourself, disappear, rationalize, stay safe. The soul says, return, speak, risk tenderness, tell the truth. When someone has lived too long behind armor, love feels like an invasion even when it is gentle. The psyche interprets openness as danger because history trained it to. So the person withdraws to breathe, to regain control, to reduce the intensity. Yet, the intensity does not actually reduce, it simply moves underground, where it appears as restlessness, nostalgia, sleeplessness, and the haunting persistence of a name. Here is where many hearts collapse. They interpret the other's shadow as a verdict on their worth. But empowerment demands a different interpretation. Their fear may be real, their struggle may be real, yet the self is not required to sacrifice dignity on the altar of someone else's unfinished healing. Compassion does not mean self-erasure. If a connection is meaningful, it will not demand that the inner feminine becomes smaller, it will demand that she becomes steadier. This is why the divine plan, translated into psychological language, can be understood as a soul agreement, not a mystical contract that removes responsibility, but a developmental encounter that insists on growth. Some relationships arrive as initiation. They awaken, they destabilize, they call forth the shadow, they illuminate the old script, and then they demand a higher level of consciousness than the one that existed at the beginning. In that sense, the bond feels unbreakable, not because it is guaranteed, but because it is doing work. The psyche will not let the lesson go until the lesson is integrated. So the question is no longer, will they come back? The question becomes, who must the self become so that love, if it returns, can exist without repeating the old suffering? This is the turning point, the shift from fixation to transformation, from waiting as punishment to waiting as preparation. The old self waits with tension, scanning the horizon, clinging to numbers and signs like lifelines. The empowered self waits differently. She waits while building a life. She waits while healing her attachment wounds. She waits while strengthening boundaries. She waits while remembering that love is meant to expand her, not consume her. Detachment, then, stops being a cold spiritual slogan and becomes a discipline of emotional sovereignty. Magnetic detachment does not mean giving up. It means releasing the frantic grasping that communicates lack. It means refusing to chase through thoughts, not just actions. Because energetic pursuit is real in the psychological sense, it is the constant inner leaning, the obsessive checking, the silent bargaining, the compulsive rereading of silence as a riddle. Each time the mind reaches outward for proof, it abandons the inner center. Each time it returns inward, it becomes whole again. Jung would say that what is not integrated becomes fate. If the self has not integrated her fear of abandonment, she will keep encountering abandonment-shaped experiences. Not because the universe is cruel, but because the psyche is seeking completion. The path out is not control, it is integration. The self learns to sit with uncertainty without degrading herself. She learns to feel longing without turning it into a verdict. She learns to trust intuition while also honoring reality. She learns that the highest form of love is not obsession, but presence, and something subtle happens when this inner recalibration begins. The emotional field clears, the nervous system softens, the heart becomes quieter not because love is gone, but because it is no longer weaponized against the self. This quiet is powerful. It is the energy of someone who knows her worth regardless of outcome. It is the frequency of a woman who is not trying to force destiny, because she has stopped treating destiny as the only source of meaning. This is also where the signs change quality. They stop being frantic and start being clean, less like anxiety and more like clarity. The mind is no longer hunting. The soul is simply noticing. The inner world becomes more receptive. A song appears at the right moment. A memory arrives with tenderness rather than pain. A wave of warmth rises without desperation. Whether one names this synchronicity or unconscious resonance, it is the same message. The self is returning to alignment. And alignment is not passive. It is a decision. It is the decision to stop interpreting love as something that must be earned through endurance. It is the decision to stop worshipping silence as if it is meaningful simply because it hurts. It is the decision to build a life that does not pause its own growth while waiting for someone else to become brave. Because bravery must be chosen, healing must be chosen, reciprocity must be chosen. The universe may guide, but it does not replace agency. In the next phase, the deeper reasons for separation become clearer, not as punishment, but as initiation. The shadow will be named more directly. The purpose of the pause will be understood as maturation, and the self will learn how to hold faith without surrendering her standards. What is being prepared is not just reunion. What is being prepared is the capacity to receive love without losing the self inside it. As the inner ground steadies, the meaning of separation begins to reveal itself with less cruelty and more coherence. What once felt like abandonment now appears as a threshold, an initiatory pause, where the psyche is forced to evolve beyond its earlier form. Jung understood this as the necessary tension between opposites, closeness and distance, desire and restraint, hope and realism. Without this tension, consciousness stagnates. With it, something more mature can be born. The pause exists because the original dynamic could not survive its own intensity. Love that arrives before awareness often collapses under the weight of unhealed patterns. One reaches for reassurance, the other retreats to preserve control. One interprets silence as rejection, the other experiences closeness as danger. This is not destiny failing, it is destiny insisting on refinement. The psyche refuses to repeat the same lesson until it is learned properly. What feels like delay is actually calibration. In this phase, the shadow becomes unavoidable. The shadow is not evil, it is everything the ego learned to hide in order to survive. Fear of abandonment, fear of engulfment, fear of being truly known, these forces rise when a connection threatens the old defenses. For one soul, the shadow may express itself as clinging, overthinking, self-blame. For the other, it may express itself as withdrawal, silence, rationalization. Neither position is superior, both are invitations to awareness. This is why the separation works on both sides simultaneously. While one soul is forced to confront fear of vulnerability, the other is forced to confront fear of self-trust. While one learns courage, the other learns calm. While one dismantles avoidance, the other dismantles dependency. This is not romantic fantasy, it is psychological symmetry. Individuation does not occur in comfort, it occurs where patterns are interrupted. The most radical empowerment in this phase is the refusal to turn pain into prophecy. The mind wants to decide, this hurts, therefore it will end badly, or this hurts, therefore it must be destiny. Both are shortcuts. The empowered psyche resists premature conclusions. It allows uncertainty to exist without collapsing identity around it. It understands that not every intense feeling is a command, and not every pause is a negation. This is also where faith must be purified. Faith that demands proof is not faith, it is bargaining. Faith that collapses under silence was never stable. True faith, psychologically speaking, is coherence between inner values and outer behavior. It means acting with self-respect even when the outcome is unknown. It means refusing to chase through fear. It means trusting that what belongs to the self will meet her in clarity, not confusion. Here, the practice of detachment deepens, not as avoidance, but as energetic hygiene. Detachment is the decision to stop feeding the anxious loop, checking, imagining, waiting for signs to soothe insecurity. Each time the psyche withdraws its attention from fixation and returns it to creation, work, embodiment, pleasure, growth, the nervous system learns safety, and safety is magnetic. not because it manipulates the other, but because it aligns the self. As this alignment strengthens, the emotional field changes, the longing becomes quieter, less sharp. The sadness, when it arrives, feels informative rather than overwhelming. The memories lose their power to destabilize. This is not because love has diminished, but because the self has expanded. The inner feminine has reclaimed her throne. She no longer interprets waiting as worthiness. She no longer equates endurance with devotion. At this point, something subtle but decisive occurs in the invisible dimension, whether one names it unconscious, resonance, or energetic shift. When pressure dissolves, resistance has nothing to push against. The other soul, if still entangled in fear, begins to feel the absence more sharply. Not because of manipulation, but because the old dynamic has ended. The chase is gone. The emotional noise has quieted. What remains is truth. Often, this is when inner telepathy becomes clearer rather than louder. The sensations are not frantic, they are precise. A calm warmth replaces anxiety. A sudden clarity arrives without drama. These experiences no longer feel like questions, they feel like confirmations. The psyche is no longer trying to force meaning, it is simply receptive. This is also where the collapse of fear begins on the other side. Avoidance can only survive while distraction is available. When the inner feminine withdraws her energy from pursuit and returns to her life, a vacuum forms. The silence that once felt protective begins to feel hollow. The cost of distance outweighs the fear of closeness. The psyche reaches a tipping point. It can no longer deny what it feels without denying itself. Yet, empowerment requires one more discipline: non-attachment to timing. The moment fear collapses elsewhere is not controlled here. And this is essential. If reunion is meant to occur, it must arise from readiness, not pressure. It must arrive with clarity, not confusion. Anything else would simply recreate the old wound under a new name. So the task now is not anticipation, but embodiment, living fully, speaking truth inwardly, holding standards without aggression, trusting without naivete. This is the integration phase where love is no longer something hoped for, but something already practiced internally. The psyche becomes whole regardless of outcome, and that wholeness is the true victory. In the final movement, the signs of return or of final release will be interpreted without fear, because by then, the self will understand that destiny does not reward suffering, it rewards consciousness, and whatever arrives next will arrive because both souls are finally able to meet without hiding from themselves. When consciousness reaches this level of steadiness, the meaning of return transforms. It no longer refers solely to the physical reappearance of another person, but to the restoration of inner coherence. Jung described this as the moment when the psyche stops projecting its lost parts outward and begins to reclaim them. Love, then, is no longer a hunger aimed at a specific figure. It becomes a state of alignment that can receive without grasping and release without collapse. This is why the final signs of movement feel different from earlier ones. They are quieter, cleaner, almost understated. The psyche no longer trembles with urgency. Instead, there is a sense of inevitability, not dramatic certainty, but calm recognition. The inner voice does not shout, "This must happen." It simply knows that whatever happens will not destroy the self. This is the threshold of emotional sovereignty. If reunion approaches, it does so through clarity rather than confusion. The energy is no longer fragmented. Communication, when it resumes, carries a different quality: direct, grounded, reciprocal. The ambivalence has been burned away by the dark night of the soul. What returns is not the person as they were, but the person as they have been reshaped by loss, fear, and reckoning, and the self who receives them is also no longer the same. She does not reach forward in desperation. She stands rooted, able to say yes without disappearing, and no without terror. If reunion does not arrive in physical form, something equally significant occurs. The bond dissolves without bitterness, the name loses its charge, the memories soften, the psyche integrates the experience as initiation rather than failure. The love is not denied, it is honored for what it awakened. This, too, is destiny fulfilled, because individuation does not promise a specific outcome, it promises wholeness. This is the crucial truth many resist. Destiny is not proven by endurance of pain, but by the expansion of consciousness. If a connection teaches self-abandonment, anxiety, and shrinking, it is not sacred no matter how intense it feels. If a connection leads the self back to clarity, boundaries, self-trust, and emotional maturity, then it has served its purpose whether it continues or concludes. Meaning is measured by transformation, not possession. The empowered feminine understands this deeply. She no longer measures love by how much she can tolerate. She measures it by how much she can remain herself. Her intuition is no longer frantic. It is discerning. She does not confuse persistence with destiny. She recognizes that what is truly aligned does not require her to betray her own nervous system. In Jungian terms, this is the integration of the shadow. The fear of abandonment no longer rules behavior. The fear of vulnerability no longer dictates silence. The psyche becomes a unified field rather than a battlefield, and from this place, any relationship, romantic or otherwise, must meet her at eye level or not at all. This is also where the deepest lesson settles. Silence was not meaningless. Distance was not random. The pause was not cruelty. It was the psyche's way of preventing a premature union that would have collapsed under unconscious weight. The separation acted as a crucible, burning away illusion, compulsion, and fantasy until only truth remained. What survives this fire is real. What does not was never meant to be carried forward. The universe, understood psychologically, never conspires against growth. It interrupts when repetition would damage the self. It delays when immediacy would reinforce old wounds. It withdraws when attachment threatens identity. And it reunites only when both parties can stand in presence rather than need. This is not punishment, it is protection. So the final posture is neither waiting nor forcing. It is living, creating, loving life as it unfolds, allowing joy to exist without guilt, allowing desire without desperation, allowing faith without surrendering agency. From this posture, the future no longer feels like a threat or a test, it feels like an open field. And if love returns, it will recognize this version of the self immediately, not because she chased, but because she became unmistakable. If love does not return in the expected form, something else will, something equally aligned, equally conscious, equally capable of meeting her depth without fear. Because the psyche that has integrated its lesson no longer attracts the same story twice, the ultimate truth is simple and difficult. What is meant to stay will stay without costing the self her dignity. What is meant to leave will leave without destroying her worth. Destiny does not require self-sacrifice, it requires self-knowledge, and once that knowledge is embodied, fear loses its leverage. This is the closing realization. The bond was never meant to imprison the heart, it was meant to awaken it, and now that awakening is complete, if this reflection resonated with your own inner journey, take a moment to support the work. Like the video if it brought clarity, share it with someone who may need this message, subscribe for more long-form reflections, and leave a comment about what part spoke to you most.